Yes, ma'am, you want to answer questions? She's just pissed. Hello. Lola is here, but she's, having her third nap of the day at 8 a.m. So we're doing well. But today I'm going to answer some questions from my Instagram. So I put up a Q&A box for some long form questions yesterday. And I'm also going to answer some questions that I got regarding my squat video, like a squat vlog I did on my Instagram last week. So just had a couple questions that were better in long form. And because I'm a certified yapper, YouTube was going to be the better option for that. I also have my Instagram pulled up on my computer here, which feels illegal and diabolical, but that is how we're going to roll today. So first question that I'm going to take from the squat blog was talking about RPE and like how I interpret RPE, particularly when it comes to squats. So I am not great with RPE 100%. And that's a pretty common thing for people who are neurodivergent. Neurodivergent people struggle with a concept called interoception. So interoception is kind of the ability for us to understand what is going on in our own bodies and to understand that in a meaningful way. So think of things like hunger signals, fullness cues, having to pee, etc. Like it's kind of a meme that people with ADHD and stuff like that don't know when they're hungry and they don't know when they have to pee, but that's actually quite real for a lot of people because we just don't have a good sense of that. So for me, rating RPE, I have to reframe it a little bit because it's not necessarily so much about my effort as it is like a more reps and reserve type model for me. So with squats in particular, I have a really hard time rating my RPE on squats, and I sort of constantly sandbag it. And right now, like we're running some heavy Hatfield stuff to help with that. And I'm trying to be very intentional about like actually pushing myself on my squats because I'm such a chronic sandbagger. So what I like to think about is, could I do another rep? And if so, like how good would that rep look? So for me, like an RPE 8 is probably like, I can do another rep or two and they're gonna look maybe a little tough, right? RPE 9 is like, I could maybe squeeze out another rep, but it's gonna be not very pretty. And then RPE 10 is like, I need to go lay down and die for about 30 minutes until I can get up and like resume my life. So that's how I approach RPE, is using more of a reps and reserve model in that way. Another question from my box yesterday was asking about the effects of SSRIs and antipsychotics on strength training. So I am not a doctor or psychiatrist, so I can't really comment on like the neurophysiological mechanisms of how that works, but I can talk about some of the common things that come up when we are taking those medications and how we deal with those type of obstacles, side effects, etc. So for both SSRIs and antipsychotics, typically what we're dealing with in terms of side effects that impact our training are going to be things like differing fatigue levels, appetite changes, whether that is a lack of appetite or upregulation of appetite, which can cause some weight gain as a consequence of that medication, and then also things like hydration and sleep. So when we're talking about all of those things, kind of my number one hack for the nutrition side of stuff, and this applies to folks with ADHD, autism, etc. as well, is if you are somebody who has appetite suppressant from those medications, doing the following can be very helpful. So setting timers on your phone that remind you to eat. It seems silly, but it is very helpful. And even if you have to set them like 3 timers in a row, like a minute apart, to be like, hey, like actually you need to go eat something, do that. 2 is having appetizing and dense foods on hand. So again, if you're suffering from a lack of appetite for stuff like that, you're probably not going to be somebody who wants to eat a whole lot of food in one sitting because you feel full or it makes you feel nauseous, etc. So focusing on more calorically and nutrient dense foods to have is a great way to go. This can be really tough for people, especially people who are like used to dieting all the time. So women fall into that category, or things like that, because our brains are sort of wired to think about how much food can I eat with like the least amount of calories versus thinking about what is the lowest amount of volume I can have for the most amount of nutrients and calories. An example would be something like a salad. So having a salad with like a protein source and stuff like that is great. We love micronutrients, we love all that sort of stuff, but it's a pretty high volume meal, right? You're gonna sit there and be eating it for a long time versus having something like maybe like a pasta salad, right? We're getting a denser carb source because pasta is going to have more carbs and calories per serving size than something like veggies, rice, etc. Throwing some veggies on that pasta salad, throwing your protein source in there, and then using like a dressing, marinade, olive oil, whatever to get your fats in. So you can have a smaller portion for the same amount of calories, but it's just gonna be a lot less voluminous. So it's not gonna make you feel as full, which is great when you already feel full all the time. Also keeping your like safe foods on hand. So if you are somebody who gets really bad food aversion, I am that person for sure, especially when I'm in meat prep. Having things that you know that you like, that you will eat, and keeping those well stocked is hugely helpful. So if, like for me, when I'm in meat prep, it's like protein shakes and gluten-free bagels. I gotta have those because that will sometimes be the only thing I eat all day long, because that's the only thing that sounds appetizing that I can actually get down that has some calories in it. So keeping stocked on those things is also great. Now, when it comes to things like hydration, this becomes very important in the summertime because a lot of SSRIs and antipsychotics can increase heat intolerance. And so people will not necessarily know that they are getting overheated when they're taking these medications, or they don't get the signals quite as readily, is probably a better way to phrase that. So staying on top of your hydration and electrolytes becomes super, super important. Also, certain medications can like give you dry mouth or just dehydrate you in general. So keeping on top of that is really important. Again, using reminders for when to drink water, drink electrolytes is super helpful. Having obviously a big water bottle can be really helpful. Like I'm a person who loves a straw, so like this is my BFF right here. That's always full of, I usually just have electrolytes because I have POTS, so I have to have a ton of sodium. But that's always there because I know that I'm going to drink out of it and I'm incentivized to do so. I don't have to refill it 17 times a day. If you're somebody who struggles with refilling things and once it's done, it's done. If you have multiple bottles or drinking vessels, refill them at night, keep them in the fridge, and then just grab them if you're somebody who likes cold water and stuff like that. So do everything you can to make your life easier in the like short term, right? So when it comes to things like sleep and fatigue, some of these medications can have sleep disturbance issues. So you're not getting quality sleep, you're waking up through the middle of the night, which there are a couple things that we can do for that. Having a really solid bedtime routine that is focused on like relaxation and stress reduction is huge. I'm not gonna give all the standard like sleep advice of like get off your phone and all that sort of stuff because everybody's pretty different. But I do notice that for myself and clients, making sure your room is like a comfortable temperature seems to be extremely important. If you're too hot, it's not gonna be a good time. If you're too cold, it's not gonna be a good time. And then if you're somebody who is having like too much sleep, like it's making you super sleepy, if you can, altering your training times to be during your high energy times can be a really good way to sort of maximize not being sleepy when you're training. And as a certified sleepy girl with chronic fatigue, that's been a big one for me, especially. Now, overall, when we're talking about like psychiatric medications, we can't really ignore the conditions that we're using the medications for. So in the case of things like anxiety and depression, it can be really difficult to get to the gym, to do your training, etc., when we're dealing with those things and when we're having like a flare up of those things. As we're sort of coming out of winter into the spring, people are feeling a little bit more, I don't want to use the word motivated, but it's the best word that I got, like motivated to go outside, to get in the gym, etc. So use this as a time to set those good foundational habits and routines that are going to carry you through the times where you are having flare-ups of those things. And then when you are having flare-ups of those things, being gentle with yourself and sort of committing yourself to what I call like doing the least. Like what are the bare minimums that you need to do each day to feel good? So with my clients, we typically come up with anchor actions. So there's usually like 3 things that we want to do during the day that are sort of our non-negotiables that help us feel our best. So it can be anything. People have their own ones. For me, it's drink water, eat food, some sort of movement. That some sort of movement can be a walk, it can be training, it can be 3 minutes of stretching, whatever it is, it doesn't matter, because we're not focused on doing it perfectly, we're just focused on doing it, period, and being consistent in doing that. And if you are somebody also who like struggles with consistency and stuff due to mental health flare-ups, if you have a coach, talking with your coach about that is super important. It helps us, like from a coaching side, recognize patterns that are going to be helpful in our programming, and also it helps us come up with contingency plans that we can share with you or that we can collaborate on together, so that like if we're having a week where we're probably not going to get to the gym more than like once or twice, that's totally fine. Let's maximize the time that we are able to do that and like change training accordingly. That is always an option. So having those contingency plans in place is super important. And what is more important is making those contingency plans when you have the energy and capacity to do so. Because when we are depressed, we don't have the energy and capacity to do so. So that's not a great time to do the planning. Put the plans together and put those in place before you need them. That way, when you do need them, you don't have to go through all the mental effort and energy of trying to come up with a plan. You can just sort of like read it, execute, and eliminate a bunch of steps. Now, on a physiological level, most of these medications are going to be altering things related to serotonin and dopamine, whether that's the reuptake of those things, the production of those things, how those things are interacting with other neurotransmitters, etc. And people sort of misconstrue what dopamine does, especially. We just think of it as like a reward and pleasure thing, but dopamine is actually responsible for quite a lot in terms of our daily motivation. And I don't mean motivation in like the weird, gross, fitnessy way. I mean motivation in like, if I need to take a shower, how am I able to do that? And so we can also kind of conceptualize this as executive functioning. So when we're having alterations of those like levels of things, it's not uncommon for us to feel maybe a little bit down, like we're not super motivated to do certain tasks of daily living, or not have the capacity to do things above those tasks of daily living. So knowing yourself and recognizing your patterns with that becomes very important, because that can help inform your training in terms of, knowing when you want to compete, what you want to periodize your training as. And if you have a coach, communicating that can be helpful, because it helps us plan our programming and stuff around that. So again, we can take that off of your plate so that you can just kind of be an athlete and execute in that way. That was a very long tangent. I need water. We need a water break right now. So, other questions from the question box. Priorities with mobility work for somebody with hypermobility. Okay, so I am somebody who has hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos. I work with a lot of people who are hypermobile as well. And there's sort of this like camp of thought of like people who with hypermobility need to do quote unquote mobility work, or they need to like only do mobility work and can't lift weights in any capacity. And I will say that people's level of ability is drastically different person to person when we're talking about chronic illness, disability, etc. Just because I can do something doesn't mean that the next person can do something, and just because they can do something doesn't mean I can do something. And so we want to take that into consideration. Now, when we're talking about mobility, we're kind of talking about a couple of things that get lumped into that are really like separate. So we've got flexibility, which is going to be like our passive range of motion. We've got mobility, which is going to be our active range of motion. And then we've got stability, which is how we stabilize things. And people with hypermobility obviously have more mobility, and they also tend to have higher flexibility, but we sort of lack stability. That is a problem, right? We sublux joints, things get tweaky, there's a lot of pain from that. So understanding how hypermobility works can inform what we need to prioritize and work on when we're doing like quote unquote mobility work. So when we have a hypermobile joint, shoulder is a great example. If my shoulder is hypermobile, right, the joint itself has got excessive range of motion. because that is true, my brain is going to tell the muscles surrounding said joint to be a little bit tighter because it doesn't want my shoulder dislocating constantly or like falling off into space. And so as a result, a lot of people with hypermobility have pretty distinct patterns of like tightness, or what would be called like hypertonic muscles. So with the shoulder, for example, probably got super tight pecs, super tight traps, kind of that classic, very coat hanger pain situation. Probably some tight scalenes as well, SCM, which comes through here. All of this pretty tight. But what we don't have is a lot of stability, right? Because obviously our muscles are sort of tightening up because that shoulder is not stable. And the things that we need to stabilize the shoulder aren't actually stabilizing the shoulder. So what we want to focus on when it comes to mobility stuff is getting the right things to come to the party so that the other stuff can kind of like calm the fuck down. And two, ensuring that we are learning how to like proprioceptively feel said joint. People with hypermobility and also neurodivergence, which can go hand in hand a lot of the time, really struggle with proprioception, which is that concept of like where we are in space, where our body is in space. And so sometimes having external cues like bands, things like that can be helpful there. But in the case of a shoulder, if I've got a hypermobile shoulder, super tight pecs, super tight traps, etc., I probably need to focus on doing things to help stabilize that shoulder. So working on my serratus anterior, working on my posterior rotator cuff muscles, things like that. So mobility work for hypermobile people might look a little bit different because the range of motion that is like impeded with my tight pecs isn't necessarily because my pec itself is like overly tight just from being overly worked. It's because it's overly tight because my shoulder wants to fall off into space. And hypermobility is highly neurological, so the more consistent we are in doing the work that we need to do, the better we will be at, again, creating that stability in the right way, getting the right things to come to the party, and alleviating some of that tightness. Okay, last question, because it's getting really long. And this is going to be a long one, which is, how long have you been lifting and how did you get started with lifting? So I've been lifting for 14 years, 15 years. I'm 36. It's been a long time. And the way that I got started lifting was actually because I was super, super sick. When I was younger, especially in college, I was not that well health-wise. I was working like 3 jobs constantly. I took like 19 credits. I was like nearly a 4.0 student all the time. So I was living a very high stress lifestyle, to say the least, as a broke college student. And as a result of that, I sort of ran myself into the ground pretty quickly. And the other side of that is that I am a woman, right, in a society that values thinness. And so I was sort of constantly trying to lose weight, get smaller, etc. Especially being a person who grew up in a bigger body sort of constantly. That was always a focus of mine. So I would do things like not eat nearly enough, just run all the fucking time because I'm a 20-something-year-old in college. What else do you do than like fucking eat sweet potatoes and run? And so that's what I was doing while living this very high stress lifestyle. And I ended up fracturing the navicular bone in my foot, which is like a bone on the top of your foot, which is a really weird one to fracture if you're not somebody who like doesn't play football or like do long jumps. And I've had a lot of knee problems as well, like tons of knee problems, probably tore a couple things a couple times that I didn't do anything about. Had like virtually no cartilage in my left knee, had to get like gel injections, all this sort of stuff while I'm like in my early 20s, right? Like this should not be happening. My sports medicine doctor at the time was like, this is all really weird. Let's get you a DEXA scan. So we did a DEXA scan to look at my bone density and discovered that I had really severe osteopenia. I think I was like 1 or 2 points away from having like full blown like problems. And she basically sat me down and was like, hey, you have to resistance train in some way. Like your bones are pretty fucked. Also, let's pursue finding out why your bones are super fucked. Turns out undiagnosed celiac will fuck up your bone density because you can't absorb anything that you eat. So that was a good time. And she basically said, like, you have to do this for your quality of life. And so me being the person that I am, I like, furiously Googled all the things and like printed out, because this is back in the day where we had to print things out. We didn't have little pocket computers really. Like a routine from bodybuilding.com or something, because that was pretty much like the only thing that existed other than some like forums. And I took myself to the gym. I was working at the college that I went to, so I went to the college gym on crutches with my foot in a boot, and I just figured shit out. And I just started lifting. And my dad has always lifted forever and like tried to teach me things when I was younger, but of course, being like a high school girl, I was like, ew, no, I don't want to lift. I don't want to be bulky. And so I just kind of figured it out, and I modified things accordingly, because obviously being on crutches in a boot means I can't do a lot of things. And I just discovered that I actually really enjoyed lifting. It was really fun. It was really motivating to see very tangible progress that was not related to my aesthetics or my body in any sort of way, because I was so focused on just like getting healthier. I really wasn't focused on like what I look like. And it taught me a lot about how to eat for performance and how to like actually feed myself in a meaningful way. And so I just kind of continued doing that. And after a while, like once my foot sort of healed up, I started like some barbell stuff. I started basically barbell back squatting. And it was like a really big deal when I did my first 135, and it was high as fuck and terrible. But I was so proud of myself for doing that. Eventually, once I had sort of committed myself to being like, hey, this is like the form of exercise that I enjoy, an acquaintance of mine asked me to go try a CrossFit class. And I was like, sure, I like lifting. CrossFit's all the rage. Let's do that. So I did. And I ended up really liking it. I went through like their little fundamentals course, discovered that I really liked lifting a whole lot more. And then I did like regular CrossFit for probably about a year or so. And the CrossFit gym that I was at had like a barbell club that was focused mostly on like Olympic weightlifting, squatting, that sort of stuff. And I was like, hey, you know what's really cool? Deadlifting. You know what's not really cool? Running. So I'm gonna do that. And so I switched over to doing like barbell club stuff and was really focused on Olympic weightlifting. I've competed in Olympic weightlifting a few times. And then I eventually started competing in strongman. My coach at the time suggested that I should try it. And there was a strongman competition like literally down the street at another gym, the gym where I am at now and have been at for like 10 years. And I was like, okay, that sounds cool, I guess. And so I trained for it the best I could, showed up, 0-2 events, had the best fucking time of my life. Truly, it was like an absolutely transformative experience. Number one, to be around like women who were so incredibly strong. And like during this time, there was not like a lot of like novice classes or a lot of women competing in strongman, period. So to be around such strong, awesome, supportive women was very game changing. And I was like, ooh, I like this. I want to do this. So I continued to compete in strongman for several years. And kind of like did weightlifting and strongman together for a long time. Still like squatted and did stuff like that. I didn't do a whole lot of benching, but kind of, did the lifting thing. And then in 2016, I think, I decided that I wanted to try powerlifting as my like off-season strongman activity. At that time, I had lost like probably 60 pounds to cut from being like a middleweight strongman competitor to a lightweight strongman competitor. So I was like 140. I'm like 195. So if you can imagine how tiny I looked, it was very, very small. And I'm pretty short, so being a lightweight was just advantageous. I'm only 5'5". And so I did that, and I decided, hey, I want to try powerlifting. At the time, I knew a couple people who powerlifted, and my coach at the time, a different coach, she was also like a powerlifter and strongman competitor. So we were like, yeah, let's go, let's do it. So I did my first meet. I started out competing in wraps because that's what everybody did back then. And it was a blast. I had such a fun time and I really enjoyed it. And so I was like, oh, I want to keep doing this too. And then in, maybe it was 2015 was my first meet. I'd have to literally look on Open Powerlifting. But in 2016, I did my first powerlifting nationals, which was the first USPA drug test in nationals. I won that. I beat one person. It's literally not a big deal. And then I also did strongman nationals that year as well. And between training for 2 national competitions, I had started coaching at the time, both in person and like a smidge online. But I had been coaching in person for a bit. So training, coaching in person. I was working at like a chiropractic office, like front desk stuff. So I had like a regular person job, online coaching, and trying to stay very small. So trying to stay basically like 140 to 145. I was pretty injured through that entire year. I showed up at Strongman Nationals with God knows what was happening with my shoulder. I tore something in my knee 2 weeks out from Nationals and literally just kind of rubbed some dirt on it and like went for it. And my coach had a really honest conversation with me after that show, being like, hey, you need to like spend probably like a year or 2 fixing your shit. And this is going to be a really good time for you to spend like focusing on your identity outside of being a competitive strength athlete, because at that point it was my entire life. And so I did, and it was so valuable and so hard. But since then I sort of rotated through weightlifting, strongman, and powerlifting, and did all 3. I still coach all 3, and I dabble here and there in some stuff, but I've been focused solely on powerlifting for the past like 2.5 years. And that's been really, really great. But that's a really long way to say that I got started lifting because I broke my foot in a really weird way from not eating enough and trying to cardio my way into oblivion. But since this is getting like really, really long now, I'm gonna cut it here. So if you made it this far, thanks for sticking around. I will hopefully be posting some more YouTube videos since I'm finally gonna actually do this whole thing. I'm not going to be very good at it, and that's going to be okay. So just hang in there with me, please. Maybe I'll get an actual camera and not have to film on my phone and have Instagram pulled up on my laptop, and like a sociopath, basically. So that is it. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Lola is also going to sign off from her little napping spot. We'll see you all next time.